to type those into our Q&A box, and we will get to those at the end of our presentations. And today we are joined by three excellent speakers. Lane Scher is a Senior Program Officer on the Board of Higher Education and Workforce at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. We also have Beka Layton, who is the Director of Professional Development Programs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And we also have Peter Espenshade, who is Associate Dean for Graduate Biomedical Education and Professor of Cell Biology at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. And the three of them will be speaking about how institutions and PIs can better support trainees looking for careers outside of academia. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Lane to talk about graduate STEM education and careers for the 21st century.
Hello, everyone. It is an honor to be here today. And to start off this talk, I am going to give an overview of three different reports that have recently come out from the National Academies and look at the big themes that really tie them together before moving on to Beka and Peter's talks. So we can move to the next slide. So this first report that I will introduce is a report called Graduate STEM Education for the 21st Century. It sort of says it all in the title. It is really looking at both master's and doctoral education. And the big focus of this report was to think about what is a student-centered education. And so within higher education, the system of research universities, there are a lot of competing interests, different incentive systems, and they don't always align to make sure that students are getting the skills that they need. What we've seen over the past decades as more and more individuals are going into jobs that are outside of academia, that education really needs to help provide students with a broad skill set. So you can hit the first bullet. We know that even if students are interested in pursuing positions in sort of the classic tenure-track academic research positions, those positions are becoming further and fewer between. And a number of individuals are going into their doctoral studies with interests that really range beyond the tenure track position. Next bullet. And within thinking about the skills that individuals get out of their doctoral studies, many of them look to gain skills that would really benefit them in all careers. And so in this report, we talk about budgeting, project management, being able to communicate effectively. And these are skills that have, over the course of a number of other reports, even going back to a 1995 report written by the National Academy, a lot of these get coded and discussed as skills that really benefit students who look to go outside academia. But for people who teach, for people who have to become department chairs, to lead labs, to do their own grants, a lot of those skills really help bolster the student's profile for any career that they might go into. Next bullet. And finally, one of the things that I know many of the people who are tuning in today are PIs, our faculty members, are interested in supporting students for that broad skill set, is that this report starts to get at how the dyadic mentor model, that one-on-one model, doesn't necessarily do the best service to either the student or really to the mentors. It increases the pressure. It kind of asks the PI, someone who is in a position to support the student, to be everything. And so it is help in the research lab, it's thinking about career prospects. And the student might have needs that are outside of that particular individual's offerings. And that is not to say that is not any hit on the individual, but it's to say that the system doesn't necessarily set up the best outcomes for either the student or for the mentors themselves. And so we'll go to the next slide. This leads us into our next report, which is looking at the science of effective mentorship in STEM. And really, if we think about the purpose and the goals of mentorship, it is to help support students to get to where they want to go with their education and professional goals. So let's look at the first bullet. One of the things that the Grad Ed report points out, and it really comes out in this report on effective mentorship, is that a mentor network, so going beyond the one-to-one, relationship from a student who has a number of different mentors, it allows students to benefit from a number of different perspectives. And they can rely on people in different ways. Someone who is helping sponsor them, so helping them get in front of opportunities, who is really sort of pushing, sort of the edge of where they're comfortable, can be very different than someone who's a coach who might be working with them on a specific skill or working a little bit more behind the scenes, to someone who is working with them sort of as the primary faculty PI mentor relationship. And it also is beneficial because different people, just as you might go to different friends or different colleagues for different issues, it allows that individual to sort of seek out people in their network who are most appropriate for whatever question they might have. So it's sort of a diversification of where students are investing in their mentor relationship. Next bullet. One of the things that we heard a lot, both in the grad report and as this report was developing, is, how does someone become a good mentor? There was a notion that sort of some people are good mentors and then some people aren't as good. And it doesn't necessarily help. The people who are good mentors are sort of looked at and looked to frequently to pick up sort of extra individuals who might need extra support. And then people who might not have sort of the natural tendencies or abilities related to mentoring, they either struggle or the relationships that they have with their mentees aren't as strong. But this report really gets into the evidence base of how to develop those skills and to really approach mentorship as something that can be developed. And just like any skill, something that needs to be periodically revisited in order to make sure that the practices are sort of at the leading edge of research and making sure that you're doing the best job that you can. A lot of the evidence base really in this report focuses on how to bridge different identities. So if you're working with someone who is, from a different race or ethnic background, different sex or gender, people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, it emphasizes that a good mentor can be anyone, and a good mentor can mentor, a number of different kinds of people. It doesn't have to be just limited to the people who have the same background as you. And if we go to the next bullet, a lot of these really do involve listening, honoring student identities, within science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. We know that there are certain disciplines that either by gender, by race or ethnicity, it could be with sexual or gender minorities, there are groups of students and identities that are not as, that have been historically excluded. And so being able to develop that cultural competency and know how to communicate effectively with students, either if it's setting up something formal in advance, like a mentoring contract, or going over expectations, discussing sort of the student's goals, periodically checking in. These can all help set up a process to make sure that the student feels that they're being heard, that their goals are being met, and can also serve as a mode of accountability in case things don't go as planned. And we can move to the next slide. And so I'll put a plug in. The National Academies now has, as of this week, 3 episodes out for their Science and Mentorship podcast, and we can go to the first couple of bullets. There will be 10 episodes overall, and they share best practices and some of the evidence base through personal stories. And so we have top scientists and researchers from a number of different fields sharing their experiences. And I'll put at the bottom in the next bullet, there is the link. So if you want to grab a screenshot of that, you can. But if you Google Science and Mentorship National Academies podcast, it's probably the easiest way to find it. Next slide. And the final thing that we'll touch on is a new report that came out from the National Academies on mental health, substance use, and well-being in higher education. And one of the things, while the report focuses on undergraduate students in addition to graduate students, underneath all of it is really thinking about how can educational and research environments support students so that they persist through their studies. Let's hit the first bullet. Doctoral students in some fields report mental health issues at up to 6 times the rate of the general population. And so one of the things, different news outlets will call this a crisis. There's definitely a lot of concern that is coming out of universities, faculty who are concerned about their students, deans who are having to understand the ways to accommodate and support students who are going through crisis. And of course, the students themselves, if they're enduring the issues or if they're supporting their peers, there are a lot of concerns about, in the sort of absence of everyone being able to have mental health care in the country, students and not, how do we make sure that students have the support that they need to be able to take care of themselves and make it through their education in a safe and healthy way? Next bullet. This is, while it's not to say that, people who are pursuing a master's or a PhD or people who are in postdocs aren't going to experience stress. This isn't to say that, everyone should be happy all the time. But if we look at some of the major stressors, especially for doctoral education, the labor market, how to make career decisions, the state of funding, how are they doing on their research toward their dissertation. And unfortunately for some, experiencing hostile education environments related to racism, to sexism, and other biases towards individual identities. Unfortunately, these are fairly common for students to experience. And depending on, their predisposition, sort of how they know how to manage stress in the beginning, and how many of these factors interact at any given time, personal life might come into it too. We all bring our whole lives to a university. The occurrence of mental health issues is something that universities should anticipate and be able and prepared to support students. And for the final bullet, so for mentors, for people who are working with students in labs, one of the ways to help support student well-being is to make sure that the environment of the research labs, the classrooms, any other settings where education occurs, they're really grounded in being inclusive to all student identities, so alleviating any of the biases that students might experience, and making sure that the policies are equitable for different races, different genders. And actually, I think one of the biggest things that PIs can do, that mentors can do, is really to honor those practices and model them themselves. So making sure that there are good boundaries between, work and play, making sure that, not coming into the lab sick, really staying home and resting when that time is, when there are vacations, to really take that time off, and to give students the permission to do it themselves. Otherwise, if you're in a lab where someone is telling you, go ahead, take time off, it's fine, but you see your boss not doing that, it sends mixed messages. And so if you're interested in hearing anything more about these reports, the grad ed and the mental health, I was the lead on those, so you can contact me at my email or in the Q&A, or you can contact Maria Dahlberg for the Science of Effective Mentorship. And with that, I will turn it over to our next panelist.
Great, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today as well. And I am excited to share with you a multi-pronged approach to helping support non-academic career pathways. And so we'll address both, if you're a trainee listening, how can you support your own career exploration? But also if you're a faculty, administrator, or staff person, how can you help to support trainees in their own career exploration? So with that, I'll go ahead and jump on in. And so we'll look at this in 3 phases: career exploration, experiential learning, which tends to be a nice bridge to try out different career paths, and then career planning. Once you know where you want to go, how do you get there? And again, we'll be looking at it from multi-pronged perspectives. And lastly, I'll be wrapping up with a magic wand. If I could make everyone have these tools, what would they be? And so those will be my magic wand secrets to share at the end. They're not really secrets, but I hope you'll enjoy them anyway. All right, next slide, please. All right, so trainees often feel like this: what direction do I go? Either they've been thinking PI forever, and then they say, okay, well, I don't want to be PI, now what? Or maybe they just look around and say, gee, I don't know what I want to do. Maybe I do want to be a PI. Maybe I want to be something else. Where do I even start? And so no matter how they're feeling, starting to have some ideas and concrete steps can really take some of the uncertainty and anxiety out of the situation to diffuse it to a manageable next step forward. Next slide, please. And so with that career exploration phase, there are a few ways that are really easy to get started. So some of these include things like exploring job ads, but many trainees say, I don't even know what job ad to look for. Well, using skill keywords can be a nice way to start paring it down. What are some keywords about skills that you like to use? And these can be transferable skills, not just science skills. Many trainees come in thinking, oh, well, that means that I need to talk about Western blots or mRNA or something that they work with at the bench. It does not have to be that, although some do want to do R&D, which is great. They can look up those keywords. But remember things like communications, leadership, teamwork, anything that you enjoy in the lab every day, thinking about those things and where might you do them in a job thereafter. And there's many ways to do that in science and science-related careers, as well as beyond that. All right, networking and informational interviews is another great way to explore. I usually have trainees say, gee, that's such a relief. I feel so lost. I just want to talk to someone. Or, oh dear God, you're going to make me interview someone. Please make that the last possible step. So wherever you fall on that scale, it can either be a good starting point if you're beginning to explore, or if you do some reading or legwork on your own, looking up a few things, it can help you narrow down or dig in and delve into more detail once you have some ideas about where you might want to head next. LinkedIn is a wonderful platform for networking. You can use the alumni search tool to actually look for folks who you aren't connected with. It's a really powerful and free platform that you can use. And you can also use search engines such as Glassdoor and Indeed to look for non-academic career pathways. And they also, both Indeed and Glassdoor do a nice job of having academic pathways as well as non-academic. So if you're thinking you might want to do higher ed or science outreach, or training in industry, and you're not really sure, you can use those type of search engines to catch all of those. And finally, of course, on your campuses or through society events like this, you can look for career workshops, seminars, and courses that are offered by different organizations throughout, again, national, regional, and local levels. Next slide, please. So one thing that, again, people start with is, gee, I don't even know where to start. So a nice way to sort of break down is, do I think I want to be at a research intensive type of position or a non-research intensive position? And oftentimes people kind of have a gut reaction to that. Like, gee, I love the bench. I definitely want to be in R&D. Or, yeah, I'm kind of leaning towards doing something else, but I don't know what yet. And so that's a nice sort of first step to think about, where might you go? So here's an example of a paper that we did a few years back looking at different types of career tracks. And we actually will talk about in a little bit what skills are associated with these career tracks. But currently, this is just to give you some ideas of all the different sectors you can work in and the different types of roles that fall under these. And this is not comprehensive. This is just one way that you can break it down. But as you can see, there's tenure track industry, non-tenure track and government research under research intensive. So lots of different ways and places that you can do that. And again, not comprehensive, but just some ideas. There's also startups, entrepreneurship, self-employed, freelance, lots of other options as well. CROs, things like that, contract research organizations. And below that, you'll see a lot of non-research intensive careers as well. And we'll get to those in just a few minutes. But just to highlight a couple, science writing, communication, science policy, IP, and regulatory affairs are quite popular ones. And then, of course, teaching and administration is pretty broadly known, I think. All right, next slide, please. I'm not going to read all of these. Again, I'll just leave these up here. Many of these you saw on the previous slide, but you can see this is another way we track career interests every couple of years with our trainees. And this just shows you roughly with our trainee population at UNC, what types of careers are they interested in? And then we adjust our programming accordingly. And so you'll see lots of folks are interested in being in that research intensive role, but there's quite a few who are interested in pursuing other pathways. And this includes across all years, even students coming in the first year sometimes have already identified career pathways that are not necessarily at the bench or not in academia. Next slide, please. This is an example from a publication out of UCSF. This is one of the earlier ones that had just started to explore different career pathways that people were interested in and where they were going. And so again, I'll give you a moment to just peruse through them. You may see something you hadn't thought of before as a career pathway. And so looking at data like this, either from publications or from career outcomes, and we'll talk a bit about career transparency for PhDs more broadly, and some of the great movements that have sprung up to start encouraging this. But again, just looking at these and seeing what titles pop up can be a way to get some inspiration as well. Next slide, please. Once you have some ideas of what you might want to do, and we'll talk about what I like to call A and A prime, some exciting career pathways that you think might be a good fit for you. Importantly, we don't call it Plan B. You should have a couple of skill areas that you're developing simultaneously so that you have options and choices whenever you want to make those. So once you have those couple identified that you may want to explore in more depth, Intersect Job Sims is a fantastic resource that allows you to actually do experiential learning on your own time. It takes 2 or 3 hours to do any particular simulation. There's, I think, over 24 now in all different career tracks, including things like regulatory affairs, IP. There's examples of higher ed administration, among many, many others. And you can actually try tasks that professionals in those fields do day to day that were developed with career professionals in academic PhD career pathways that work together to create these modules. Site visits are another great way to explore what might you want to do. Do you like the culture of a company? Do you even want to be at a company? Would you rather prefer being in a government role? Maybe you don't know. Well, guess what? Try it out and see. Similarly, if you have tested out the waters with some of these baby steps that I mentioned already, maybe you're up for doing an internship. And so again, there's kind of a broad spectrum of everything from dipping your toe in from your home at your computer to going in person to doing a longer term internship. I did want to point out the elite the elite site visit program. It's a consortium locally here in the Research Triangle between NIEHS, UNC, and Duke. And so we actually have a toolkit published. So if you're thinking you might want to do that, but it seems unmanageable, make a collaboration in your region where you can trade off who's planning them. And it's a really nice way to create an opportunity for site visits if it feels overwhelming to do on your own. Next slide, please. Career planning can take many, many forms, again, from your own chair to meeting with your PI, to speaking with career professionals at your institution. But some great places to get started are My IDP, which AAAS developed with some graduate education professionals in the field. Again, it's a few years old, but it's got nationally normed data, and it is biomedical science focused, so it's really specific to our career fields. And then Imagine PhD, also developed with nationally normed data. That one is interdisciplinary. It has a bit of a focus on social sciences and humanities, but is also some newer data, and both of them are wonderful tools. So I encourage you to check those out. Both of these include self-assessment tools, which will allow you to do some self-reflection about what you enjoy most doing today. And that can be as simple as sitting and writing down on a piece of paper, like what parts of my day do I enjoy the most, or doing journaling, or kind of informal reflections, to using the tools on these websites where you can actually rate on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do I like each of these tasks? And then it will actually match you up with different career pathways that, according to national norms, people who went into those career pathways have selected and rated highly themselves. And so you can see what kind of recommendations come out of that. Again, take them with a grain of salt, but it may give you ideas of career pathways you haven't heard about before. Relatedly, when you do that, there are actually read ahead buttons where you can actually click on any of these career pathways that you maybe hadn't heard about, and link to websites and data resources that will tell you more about what does that mean. And then, of course, you can move on to informational interviews, internship, site visits, some of those other things we mentioned once you've kind of gotten some of that exploration out of the way. Finally, and very importantly, My IDP and Imagine PhD allow you to set SMART goals for yourself. So for anyone who's not familiar with these are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bound. There's a couple of variations of them, but those are the general categories that those fall into. And goal setting research has shown that you are more likely to be successful the more specific you can be. And so setting a SMART goal is just a tool to help you create more effective goals. So as you're thinking about doing that, these are some tools you can use. Again, you can use a spreadsheet, a Word document that lives on your desktop that bothers you every day because it pops up, whatever will work best for you. But these are some nice tools where it will send you automated email reminders. You can check it off as you do it. Of course, there's lots of apps these days you can use as well if you like doing one of the Todoist or Wanderlust or other types of apps that you just like to check things off. Those are available as well. All right, next slide. So these are just a couple of screenshots to show you some of the things available on My IDP. You'll see the assessments on the sort of left top-ish section, skills assessments, interests, and values. Again, you're going to see those same 3 in just a moment on Imagine PhD. And then if you do want to consider fit, you'll click below that in the career exploration section, and then you can again read about those careers. Then when you scroll down, you'll see that goal setting section where you can actually create your own goals and then track them over time to see how well you're doing and have it remind you automated reminders as well. Next slide, please. This is the Imagine PhD interface. As you can see, it looks a little different, but it has all of the same key components, that interest, skills, and values assessments. Those are sort of crucial to career development and career exploration. Once you have those things, you can move forward to that career exploration step. So this is a really great first step. Importantly, for our faculty members, these are a great way to have conversations with your students. So whether your department has required forms that you're already filling out to discuss or not, you may consider having your trainees pre-fill this out to do some exploration and look at their own interests and do some of that self-reflection exercise before your career conversations. And if you're not yet having career conversations, NIH data has suggested that they are extremely effective in both helping people persist in science, achieve their PhD, as well as find satisfying career outcomes. So definitely encourage you to have those conversations with your mentees if you're on the fence about it. It does seem to really impact them in a positive way. Next slide, please. All right, so why might we do this? I think Peter is going to get more to this in his talking a little bit too, but like why are we even talking about all of these careers? Well, as you saw in the description for this, many students and trainees and postdocs are not going into faculty career tracks. This is very different from decades ago when most everyone was going into a tenure track academic field thereafter. And as you can see, we have lots of folks who are in tenure track or faculty PI research intensive roles, but quite a lot of folks are doing other things. And so in order to reflect that, we need to prepare our trainees for a broad array of careers that they can then select what they are most excited about doing. Next slide, please. And that is from UNC data. Our dashboard is below if you do want to check it out. Well, you may think, why are we preparing people for all these different careers? Well, it turns out that these skills kind of hang together pretty well. So if you look at these skills, there is some variation. You can look at all those career tracks that I mentioned earlier and where they fall with the colored dots. You can see they kind of hang together. There are a few outliers here and there, but in general, many of these transferable skills are broadly relevant across career paths. So you can see things like time management, communications, gathering evidence, managing projects, working on a team, etc. Next slide, please. You can click through, there's a couple of nexts here and one more. All right, great, thank you. So one of the key findings from our research suggested that there are a lot of skills for which there's no difference between research intensive and non-research intensive careers, using a logistic regression to predict which ones are distinct. There are a few that lean more towards research intensive or non-research intensive careers. And when I get to my magic wand in just a moment, I'll tell you more about the Venn diagram, what falls in the middle where you can spend most of your time. Next slide, please. This is just briefly to just show that we had trainees who had graduated as alumni rate what skills they developed in career training, as well as what they use on the job. And as you can see, while there are some gaps, rating pretty highly here across the board. The acquired doctoral skill is the darkest bar. And so you can see for discipline-specific knowledge on the left, some of those dark bars are actually even over preparing our trainees, but most of them are somewhere in the middle where it's pretty commensurate with the training as well as their needs later. And then off to the right, you can see there are some disparities, most notably career planning and awareness, which was below the midpoint of neutral on the scale, which is not great. So that is something, just to emphasize again, we need to do better at in academia. Next slide, please. So what resources might you point students to if they come to you looking for where do I go next? So NACE and ONET are great resources. ONET allows you to look by skills in a national database that is updated by the government. NACE allows you to look at the crossover between education and professional skills. Inside Higher Ed has a fantastic Carpe Careers column that is written by graduate career consortium members, which I'll get to in a moment. And they have weekly posts that you can read from a number of different authors about PhD specific career pathway advice. And so those are great to check out. Professional societies like FASEB also have fantastic resources as well. Don't overlook those because each society that you may belong to will have often their own research page. So do check those out. Next slide, please. Organizations where we might be focusing for policy and leadership, many of the reports that Lane mentioned are included. And I know Peter will be talking about some other exciting options to think about as well as far as setting policy and leadership within and outside of your organizations. But a couple that I wanted to highlight is Council of Graduate Schools Career Pathways, Coalition of Next Generation Life Sciences, which focuses also on career outcomes and transparency in PhDs. NIH, Broadening Experience in Scientific Training, BEST, Future of Research, Rescuing Biomedical Research, and NIGMS, who has more recently really been advocating and actively requiring programs to get funding to actually adhere to some of these best practices. So just wanted to bring those to your attention. Of note, this will all be in a handout that will be provided as well, and links to all of the links that Lane shared, that Peter will share, and that I have shared here as well are included in that handout. Next slide, please. I mentioned some organizations for graduate career practitioners. So if you are someone who works in the field of graduate career professional development, here are some organizations to check out. Again, this is not comprehensive, but a couple of really key players here. The Graduate Career Consortium, or GCC, National Postdoc Association, and AAMC Great Group all have conferences and really great resources and websites. So if you're new to this, good things to check out. And on the handout, there's also a link to NIH OITE, Train the Trainer. So if you're brand new to the field, you can get spun up really quickly in a very intensive and fantastic training opportunity there. Next slide, please. Okay, my magic wand. What do I wish everyone could know about PhD career training? So I already mentioned have a plan A and have an A prime. You can even have an A prime prime. The idea is to not make it feel that you have to find your one thing. When people go to try to find that perfect thing, they often feel paralyzed, stalled out, demotivated. When you give them the option to look for things they're excited about that match their skills, interests, and values, suddenly they light up and they're excited. And that's the idea. Everyone should be excited to pursue whatever career step is next for them. Holistic career planning, the career, academic, and personal edges of the triangle. I like to actually show them when I'm talking about it. If you ignore any of them, your triangle is still going to be lopsided and those things will still happen. So we just recommend going ahead and planning for those. And even though in science we say we're scientists, we don't talk about personal life, but we have a personal life and it's important. We bring our whole self to the lab and to science every day. It's important to acknowledge that and plan for those things. I already alluded to the Venn diagram of skills, but where's that overlap where you can be working towards a couple of career pathways and really developing the core skills such as communications, leadership, management, et cetera, and looking for your career pathways. Where do those intersect? If you're not sure, try it. That's a great way to test the waters and pay it forward. People want to help. Imagine someone came to you to ask, what is it like to be a graduate student, postdoc, faculty member, staff administrator? Of course, you're going to want to help and tell them, and you'd be excited to watch their career blossom and move forward. Think about that when you reach out to people. You're not a burden. They'll just say no or not respond if they don't have time. With that, that was my parting thought. I will turn it over to Peter, who I believe is up next. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beka. And thanks to FASB for the invitation to be here today. My name is Peter Espenshade. I'm a professor at the School of Medicine at Johns Hopkins, and I'm also the Associate Dean for Graduate Biomedical Education. So what does that mean? That means I oversee our master's and PhD programs. I'm also fortunate enough to oversee our professional development and career office, which is one of the reasons I can speak to how we're preparing our students for non-academic careers. And I also oversee admissions. What I'll talk about today is sort of Johns Hopkins University as a case study, but I just want to let you know, primarily my position in the School of Medicine is focused on biomedical careers and laboratory-based PhD programs. So that's my perspective and where I'm coming from. Although I can talk about, if you'd like to hear, how the things that we've started in the School of Medicine have spread across the other divisions of Johns Hopkins University. So next slide, please. So I really feel as though, Lane set up the aspirational goals from these many different reports from experts about what we should be trying to do, the environment we're trying to create for our trainees, both PhD students and postdocs in graduate education. And Beka did a wonderful job laying out, resources and practical advice about how to, train up in these different skills. And so what I wanted to do this afternoon is to just sort of tell you what we've put in place at Johns Hopkins based on this, focused on non-academic career preparation, but really simply expanding preparation of professional development from academic careers to include all careers. And then with the idea that we could tell you sort of with these aspirational goals and the resources that you should put in place, how do you try to get this done? And so in thinking about that, I came up with 3 keys, at least, that I think have led to the progress that we've been able to make. And those are shown here. They're leadership, mentorship, and resources. And I'll talk about each of these in turn. And it really is the statement at the top. I feel like our university has made a strong commitment to the professional and career development of its PhD students and postdocs. And along with this is a focus on mentorship. So next slide, please. So leadership is one of the key parts of this. And at Johns Hopkins University, we're fortunate that our president, Ron Daniels, chaired yet another National Academies panel and report that was the next generation of biomedical behavioral sciences researchers. And it was at this time that President Daniels realized that the recommendations that were coming out of this report and that have come out in other reports have been echoed for decades in some cases, and yet we had failed to make progress on that, or had made incremental progress. And so he really felt that universities like Hopkins needed to step up and do their part to move this issue forward. And it's his leadership and the fact that he wanted to back this up and set an example that has led to a lot of our success. So in addition to that leadership at the university level, our dean of the School of Medicine, Paul Rothman, and this gets into sort of some of the things we've been doing in the mentorship space, has really adopted a zero tolerance policy for mistreatment of students in the faculty-student relationship. And so I think the point here that I want to make is that strong, engaged leadership is really essential to make progress in this area of training students and postdocs, because it does ultimately require a lot of investment of resources, both financial, faculty time, administrative effort. Next slide, please. So just in terms of one concrete thing that Hopkins and President Daniels did, so coming out of this report, it was I think it was called out that we need to make these career outcomes transparent and publish them. They're in different places, and it was sort of spotty how people were doing this. And so President Daniels partnered with Chancellor Hawgood from UCSF, and they came together with 8 other institutions to form what's known as the Coalition for Next Generation Life Science. And this group commits to publishing data in a number of different areas in terms of PhD demographics, but also importantly, career outcomes. And the goal here is by reporting these, you held yourself accountable and could make progress using these benchmarks, but also provided the insight to those who are thinking about this as a career, like where do your students actually go when they leave your institution? Next slide, please. So in the 3 years that the coalition's been in place, and I've been had the pleasure of co-directing this with Liz Watkins, who's at UCSF, the coalition has grown from 10 to 54 institutions. And this speaks, it's also that these issues of non-academic career training are not unique to the US, and we have 3 non-US members, as this is a global concern and need. And I would say this is just a graphic showing some of the types of data around retention, attrition, and completion. We also have a lot of data on PhD and postdoc outcomes into different careers. And so these tools are really valuable when you're talking to your own faculty in terms of dispelling any myths about where trainees are actually going. So next slide. So that brings me to the next piece of these 3 pieces that have been important for us to make progress. And that is that faculty and faculty perspective, or what they feel their role in promoting career development for students is key. And that comes down to teaching them their role as mentors in the training process of their students. So faculty really need to see it as their responsibility to help trainees identify a career path and prepare for it. And many of you out there may have heard, if you're a faculty member, colleague, say, or maybe thought this yourself, you're like, well, how can I help? I'm a faculty member and all I know about is academic careers and how I got here. So this is true. And I'll highlight that, to combat this or to rebut this response or to counter it it's really important to have resources that faculty who don't have experience in how to prepare students for other careers have resources that you can point the students to or activities they can participate in. And also it is an important note, and I think Beka hit this home most, is that, those skills that actually are important for academic careers are also important for other careers. So it's not as though they're exclusive. Another key for us in making this progress now really was changes to the National Institute for General Medical Sciences, NIGMS's requirements for T32 training programs. And that was probably, along with the leadership and the timing of that was a catalyst for us at the School of Medicine to make some of the changes I'll describe below. Because in these training grants, it was required that there be mandatory mentoring training for faculty. You had to have a way of measuring and evaluating faculty mentoring, and then also a mechanism for removal for faculty from training programs. And so in response to these requirements and the leadership that we had. The School of Medicine now has mandatory mentoring training that's required of all faculty, and it's every 5 years, and it's 8 hours of training, both some 2 hours of online, but then 6 hours of case studies. And we have annual surveys of students who are evaluating their faculty mentors on a validated set of mentorship competencies. And we use that survey to help identify problem relationships that then we can help the students work through if they're having issues. On the policy side, Beka talked about individual development plans. Those are required across Johns Hopkins University and all of our PhD programs. We have expectation documents for both sides of the mentor-mentee relationship. Importantly, we have university level PhD review, so you can understand whether PhD programs across the disciplines have implemented these different policy recommendations of these different processes such as IDP, and you can follow up on that. And finally, in the School of Medicine, we developed something we call conflict resolution procedures, which is a stepwise process that if needed, a faculty member could ultimately be removed from the privilege of training students. And I would say that this is a mantra at our School of Medicine, is that it's a privilege and not a right to train PhD students. Next slide, please. So turning to this last component that's very important is the resources, and particularly resources around professional and career development. And at the School of Medicine for decades, we've been fortunate to have a professional development and career office. It was ably led for a long time by Donna Vogel. And at that time, it wasn't only focused on academic careers, but a lot of the programming was around grant writing, manuscript writing, I'll say also those transferable skills. We've made in the last several years a more intentional effort to expand this to address non-academic careers. So here's some sample programming about career exploration. And this office it now has 5 full-time staff, and it supports 3 divisions: our School of Medicine, School of Public Health, and School of Nursing. So we're very fortunate to have these resources, but how do you get there? And I'll say the way you get there is you bootstrap yourself there. And we've been able to do it with a combination of internal funding and external funding that's allowed us to grow this over time. And when we're able to show that some of these things have a high impact, then our administration continues to support them. So I'll just highlight 2 of those. One is the options program for biomedical PhD students. And this was launched through a grant from NIGMS. And also we have a very robust internship program that started initially with funding from our provost's office. Next slide, please. So just a bit about this options PhD career curriculum. So, Beka laid out a lot of things that people should do. It's always difficult to find time to do these things. Trainees are very focused on the research, and finding time to fit this in can be difficult. So we've created this curriculum, which is now required a curriculum by many of our PhD programs. So this is now required by 5 of PhD programs at the School of Medicine and our School of Public Health. They're listed here. And we're there are more than 215 students in these programs, but those who were later years were not required to have this curriculum. So this, I would say, while currently there are 215 PhD students, there are probably well over 300 captured by these different PhD programs. And importantly, the programming I'll describe is open to all at the university. Next slide, please. So again, this required curriculum, it has different components to it. And in the first part is very similar to what Beka laid out, which is career awareness. And so in years 1 and 2 of your training, you have to attend 3 hours of programming. In your year 3, you sort of go into more of an exploration mode, and there are 12 hours of exploration that occur in different, and I'll show those different panels. And you also are required to conduct an informational interview. And then finally, you meet with the director of this program and develop a plan to engage in other training or experiences that can help you make a career decision. Next slide, please. So we call these panels ICANN, for investigating career and networking. And these are the 3 hours of training in your first and second year, and some of these topics are listed here. You'll see that they're not limited to training, obviously, for academia alone. Next slide. And then a wonderful aspect of this in terms of more of the exploration are what we call career communities, and those communities are shown here. And here it's a multi-year community. Postdocs are part of these communities as well. So you have people at different stages of the career progression and career search, participating in discussions, sharing information, doing informational interviews in these different areas. Next slide, please. And then finally, once you've really focused in on what you think you're interested in doing, we have a number of different opportunities, internship programs, the ability to participate in the teaching academy where you can go out and teach at a local college, developing your own course curriculum. We have a consulting club and other ways that you can develop skills and network to get you ultimately to your final goal. Next slide, please. So I emphasize this, how important resources are for all of this to happen, and focus primarily on those that support professional and career development. But as Lane pointed out, this is equally important in other aspects of our students' lives. And I just wanted to highlight that we have a number of resources in the areas of health and well-being that also support our students. And this is something, if that's a particular interest of yours, I'm happy to talk about, but it's as important to provide this kind of support for your trainees as well. And the missions of these different offices, we have very fortunate to have an on-campus mental health and medical service. And there are links in the document Beka described that you can read more about this. Next slide. Okay, this is my last slide. So, I think we've made a lot of progress at Johns Hopkins in these areas. So you're thinking about, how do I try to get this done or make some progress where I am? And obviously this depends a lot on the size of your institution and the structure of your institution. But just a few tips here. I think engaging leadership is really the first step, because ultimately you're going to need a large amount of resources to keep this going and to sustain whatever it is that you start. Some of the arguments that can be made is, if you happen to have PhD programs that are funded by T32, not doing these things is really a risk of losing that program support. An argument, it's obvious that to leaders in these institutions that PhD students and postdocs are the core of the research mission and need to be invested in. I think a concrete step is you could advocate, if your institution's not part of the Coalition for Next Generation Life Science, you could advocate for that. It's one step forward in terms of making the data transparent, and it'll advance discussions locally. Of course, you want to engage the stakeholders in this, PhD program directors, students, and postdocs, to help you advocate for this. But importantly, please, going back to the leadership part, finances and funding are tight all across universities and research centers in the United States now. And so recognize that resources are limited, but don't let that be a complete deterrent. And so my recommendation is just to aim for steady progress and keep beating this drum. And finally, as Beka pointed out, in the meantime, as you're developing your own local resources, there are a lot of outstanding resources available, including those from different scientific societies. And encouraging membership in these societies is a wonderful way, not only to gain access to these resources, but also to promote the networking and scientific development of your trainees. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you to Lynn and Beka as well. And we'll get to some questions. And if you have any questions, just type them into the Q&A box and we can see them. Let's see what we have on here. So one question is, this is for Beka. The IDP would work in normal times. How about the insecure times we live in? Any solution?
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in on that. So I didn't put this one up, but we have a great slide in the extras that has kind of like a curly Q, and it says like your career. So I think while it's important to have a plan, being open to and ready to let it evolve and have flexible solutions is really important. And that's where having that A and A prime or A prime prime is really crucial. So for instance, let's say, you didn't plan on having kids, but you fell in love, got married, and had a kid in grad school. Great. Now you may not want to move geographically. That may change what your career priorities are, and that's fine, right? Maybe you have elder care that you have to take care of with your parents. Maybe you just decide that you don't want to live where there's snow, whatever the case may be, right? You can choose because you have options. So for instance, if you have an IDP and a professional development plan and you're willing to continue revisiting it and updating it and setting goals and checking in, having accountability buddies can be really important. Someone who's at a similar career stage. I always check in with trainees and say, who's best for you? Is it that nagging parent that you talk to every day on the phone, a roommate, someone in your lab who's also doing some career exploration, whoever you're going to talk to regularly who will check in and say, did you do your career stuff this week? Because if you don't make time for your own professional development, who will, right? And that's not rhetorical, because the answer is no one, right? So you have to prioritize it or it won't happen. And to Peter's point, there's never enough time. But even if you can do 15 minutes once a week or a half an hour, we say it's a self date, right? Have a glass of wine on your Saturday night and do a self date once a month to check in with yourself on where you're going, how you're doing, or Sunday morning with your first cup of coffee, or whatever works best for you. But having that plan really helps kick off the thought process. And that's the important part. The plan itself can evolve and change as you go, and should, right? Because life changes, as we've seen this year, particularly.
Absolutely. And then I think this is also for Beka. Can master's students also use my IDP or only PhDs?
Yeah, so they're designed specifically for PhD career pathways, but it's absolutely useful for masters as well. The only ones it's probably less useful for is professional degree programs, so like MD or JD or something like that. But if they're looking for non-traditional pathways, it can be useful for them as well. It's just not as designed for professional masters or professional programs. It's also, even though both of them are somewhat like STEM and biology focused for my IDP and sort of humanities, social science flavored for Imagine PhD, they're both very, very cross-disciplinary and would be very valuable. So really, it's just whatever platform you're most comfortable with and style. And as far as a master's, obviously you have a little bit less time than you have in a PhD program. So it's important to be very thoughtful about what you want to accomplish each year, because that time just flies by. With a PhD, it flies by also, but you have a little bit more time to adjust aim. And I would also just add, no matter what you plan, it's okay to change partway through, just to reiterate that.
I think this question.
Ian Lou,
yes.
hey, I'm going to jump in here. There's an echo on your audio, and I think it's a little hard to hear the questions. So I'm going to jump in and make sure and read them so people can hear.
Sounds great. Yeah.
Okay. So the next question is, what is or can be the role of the government and funding agencies in promoting support to graduate students who wish to pursue non-academic careers? The question's getting at so that not all the pressure falls on the academic institutions. It continues to be a limitation that students have to commit to a postdoc and academic career in order to receive financial support.
I'll jump in with a couple thoughts on this. I think one of the big roles of government and funding agencies is they can really be thinking about the incentives that they put in place in terms of what makes a successful scientist. So for PIs, how are they being evaluated in terms of, sort of what goes into their research? If they're submitting for grants, how are they being evaluated? And I think some of the other issues are things that professional societies can help out with. How are sort of the best in a field being defined? Is it with research only? Are they bringing in mentoring? Is teaching and other service being evaluated? And so I think if we're looking at sort of the broader spectrum of how faculty, which government has a role in this, academic institutions have a role in this, so do professional societies and other parts of what Suzanne Ortega at the Council of Graduate Schools referred to as sort of the arbiters of prestige. The shift can go away from, is excellence only about creating, and supporting research, or is it about the entire enterprise of science? And if we think about the entire enterprise, the teaching, the service components, the mentoring, those have to be part of it. And the evaluation of those has to take into account what are the goals of the students. If the student is interested in other careers, if, and also I think with sort of the nature of the labor market, there aren't as, the positions that are tenure track are at the top research institutions, they're limited. And so being able to say, based on, the other ranges of careers that benefit society, that benefit science, there has to be a broadening of what excellence looks like. In short, it doesn't do a lot for funding, but in terms of incentivizing the right behavior, I think that's a way to do it. And again, not all of it should fall back on the individual mentor. Career services offices can be a great help. even if not to say specifically, here are the careers that you need, but to teach students how to look for professional development opportunities that would help them, how to build skills that will help them translate their work into a number of different areas. I think those are all ways that universities can alleviate that pressure. And government and funding institutions can start, sort of expanding their sort of their metrics and what they evaluate as high quality work. Because unless you're getting like an NSF, NRT, or some of the other sort of traineeship awards, some of these other professional development and other opportunities aren't really baked into graduate education as far as a funding model is concerned.
I would add that there was a clarification from OMB, I think in 2017, I want to say, it might have been a little earlier than that, that specified that trainees are intended to spend some portion of their time on professional development and career type training. And a lot of PIs, coming from a really good place, were like, I'm paying them an R1, like, are they allowed to be doing that, right? And so the answer was like unequivocally, yes, they are supposed to be doing that as part of their training. And I think that helped a lot because there were people who were trying to do the right thing and train their students in the way that the funding was meant for. And so I think the more that clarifications like that can be put into place, that's also really helpful. And similarly, as Peter mentioned earlier with the T32 changes for NIGMS, I think that has driven huge amounts of change. I mean, I know we've had a lot of resources available to support programs, and they're knocking down our doors to try to get those now because they want to be able to demonstrate that their students are using them, and they're trying to offer them and create visibility. And not that they weren't there before, they were, and people were using them, but it's taken a very different tone. And I think part of that is because of funding.
Yeah, I was just going to echo what Beka said there, where in terms of the government, in the biomedical, biological sciences, these training programs have revised what they see as a successful outcome, and that has driven a lot of this, in addition to providing supplemental funding or other funding opportunities to pilot new programs that, but I think the government has a limited responsibility in sustaining these, right? They provide the incentive to pilot, but then it really falls on universities and institutions to support their students through this. And ultimately, institutions will not be able to attract the best talent if they don't offer these types of programming.
Perfect. Okay, the next one is from an engineering student, faculty. They have experience in non-academic careers before they came to academia and successfully trained students for industry work. Many of us engineering faculty come with training from all over the world and understand international student issues well. We do lack an understanding of the factors that hinder underrepresented U.S. minorities and women from success in graduate and undergraduate studies. This may be a specific population and can benefit from common issues in STEM experience, including non-academic career guidance. Any FACIB webinars in this area? I should have read the last question first, and that is actually, we do not, but that is a very key component that you're hitting on there, and it's something that's worth exploring. There's a multifaceted issue, and that's something we can continue working on.
I'd actually like to just jump in and comment too that a lot in the career development world, we're beginning, and we should have done this earlier, and some places were, but I think we're doing a better job of acknowledging that diversity does impact people's career interests, career outcomes, where they're coming from, systemic barriers they may face. And I think a lot of times there's sort of a cookie cutter approach, and I think there's a much more nuanced approach that's being taken more recently. And so the Graduate Career Consortium has expanded DEI efforts to really address that and address programming and address training our practitioners to be really thoughtful about that. And there's a fantastic team that's leading that. So I hope that will continue to expand, where people will begin to think about scientific training and not just, oh, well, this is just how things are, but rather how can we create customized approaches to really make the culture of science welcoming across lots of different identity groups and not just here's how it is.
Yeah, I'll hop in. There's a joke at the National Academies that whenever a question gets brought up, we'll respond with, we have a report on that. But we do have a report that addresses the historic underrepresentation of women in sciences, engineering, and medicine. And it does take an intersectional approach. And so it not only looks at fields and how sort of the differences in gender can look the same over time. So in fields like physics, mathematics, certain disciplines in engineering, the representation might be smaller. I think a lot of them, it's around 20% women, but you'll see it's 20% women in graduate school, and then in early career faculty and in administration, so that the presence is sort of stable throughout the course of a career. For other fields, like let's take biology, there is, women have been earning degrees at a bachelor's level, at least, over 50% of the total degrees earned. But if you go into senior administration, you see sort of a tapering off over time between undergraduate, graduate, postdocs, and then all the way through early career, mid-career, and so on. And so this report really gets at some of the ways that promotion, tenure, and advancement can come into play, how different opportunities and interventions can help decrease bias, help individuals and departments review their policies to make sure they are equitable, and gets into a little bit more some of the questions of why do we see this happen in certain disciplines and what can be done. So I put that in the chat box if you're interested in learning more.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Lane. Yes, there are tons of National Academies reports from this topic. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and I know that we do have a few more questions in the chat, but I don't want to ignore those by any means. So what we will do is collect those questions and distribute them to the speakers so that they can individually respond, and then we will also post all this information on the website along with the recording. And Beka mentioned her resource that she created, which includes Lane and Peter's suggestions. That will also be on the FASB website for you to use as a resource. So we thank you all for attending. I'll turn it back over to T and Lou to close it up for us.
Hopefully that echo is better now. Yeah, just thank you all for being here today. Thank you to our great speakers for coming. And we will, as Naomi said, post this presentation and answers to your questions. Thank you all for being here today. All right, bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, T and Lou.